درود بر شما آقایون و خانم‌ها و سپاسگزارم از دعوت آقای ابن یوسف و دیگر همکاران. همونطور که گفتن این ادامه دو سخنرانی گذشته است. با عرض پوزش به انگلیسی برمیگردیم چون بسیاری از سلایدها به زبان انگلیسی هم و واژه‌هایی که استفاده میشه خیلی مشکل ترجمه کردنشون. Those of you who I can see some faces that I recognize, and therefore I'm going to have some difficulty referring to my earlier things. But as a general background, we started with the idea of the global megatrends that are happening in the world that are going to be affecting our lives over the next decades. And then the second time we went into the first line of implications for intelligent cities, intelligent societies. What does this whole thing mean? Today I wanted to pursue it a little bit more on the question of innovation. Innovation is going to be one of the ideas, concepts that we'll be hearing more and more of. This caught my eye. Those of you who know The Economist magazine, I always like the way they have in one graph, in one picture, try to convey a thought. And this struck me in terms of its simplicity, but at the same time, some of the hidden things. Will we ever invent anything useful again? This useful again. All going back to this notion of, innovation, invention, everything is to help us, to improve our lives, to live better, etc., etc. And if you notice the bottom part there, the growing debate about dwindling innovation. Now, it sounds counterintuitive, because in this era of innovation, why is this question? So puzzle that. Keep it. Those of you who were here, you will already know my style. Pay attention to the pictures. Don't look at me. Number one. Number two, I will be throwing out a few puzzles, and I hope that you will respond, and we'll have a little quiz, not a quiz, but a little mind puzzle to see what all these things mean in our daily lives. So with that introduction, one of the main themes or ideas that I threw out in the first presentation was that we are in the middle of a major paradigm shift from a paradigm of scarcity to a paradigm of abundance. And the scarcity paradigm we have basically inherited from the industrial era. Scarcity of factors of production. And the whole notion of management really goes back to that. How do you manage scarce factors of production? Land, labor, and other things. We are moving into the knowledge era, where one of the most important factors of production is knowledge. Now, it's not that the other factors are no longer important. It's that the specificity of this factor of production is such that it doesn't respond to the same laws of gravity that we were used to before. Before, it was always, if I give part of my capital to you, I will have less of. If I give my land to you, or you take a land away from me, I will have less. But if I share my knowledge, I don't have any less of it. Therefore, it's sort of like sending somebody to the moon and not telling them that there is no gravity. That the laws of nature that we have understood and dealt with over the last 200, 300 years are no longer applicable to this new era. But we have yet to invent, to create new ways of making sense of some of these things. And therefore we're stuck in between. And sometimes you can see the schizophrenia that we have. We try to apply to knowledge the same rules that we applied to the old factors of production. And this is going to be one of the biggest challenges at the societal level, organizational level, and the individual level as we go forward. Now, one of the biggest shifts that we are beginning to see is that technological progress is something that is happening so quickly that we are unable to keep up with. Now, look at the left curve. This is the typical S curve that any innovation or new products experience from, beginning of the takeoff till maturity, and then you have a cruising speed. In the 19th, 20th century, this curve was about 50 years. Today, the curve, it's the same S curve, but it's happening so fast that by the time you reach your takeoff or cruising speed, something else has happened. And you have to keep up. How many of you still have a Nokia in your pocket? Anybody? 10 years ago, I bet you we all had Nokias. So as we look to the 21st century, this is the kind of things that we need to start getting used to. It's going to happen very, very fast. And one of the major shifts that all of this means is that we have to shift mindsets. And the mindsets, if you look at it broadly speaking in terms of where we were from the industrial society mindset to this intelligent society that we are moving into, has profound implications in terms of what we talk about, how we talk about, the kinds of things that are important. We were talking about things and factories and production and competition and consumption. And the shift to talking about ideas, networks, innovation, collaboration, sustainability, these are not just words. Each one of them implies a totally different way of understanding life around ourselves, what we talk about production and things as opposed to ideas and networks. They are very, very different concepts. And we have yet, as a society, as organizations, developed ways of dealing with the implications. One of the main shifts that we are still unable to deal with in terms of explaining it, capturing it, or nurturing it, is this movement away from the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. We learned that in school, which is a fact, it's true. But the question is, in this day and age, every time a problem poses to us, do we have to apply the same rule? I submit that in the 21st century, increasingly we will be talking about the smartest distance between 2 points. It may not be the straight line. In the first, some of you who were here remember there was another slide after this I showed, which was very interesting, is the migratory patterns of birds, the ones that are going from, say, Northern Europe to South Africa. In the straight line, the shortest distance between northern Germany and South Africa takes you over the Mediterranean. And these birds flying 6,000 to 8,000 kilometers do not take a straight line. Their migratory patterns were around the Mediterranean. Why? Physicists, engineers, remember the laws of thermodynamics and what happens to hot air? Water absorbs, land repels. So birds know that the shortest distance is going to kill them and they take the smart distance around. They don't want to fly over water because they'll have a better drift over land. Can we learn as human beings from the experience of animals sometimes? And it's sometimes, I'm not saying that shortest distance between 2 points and efficiency grounds, we should not, but we have to be discerning. Sometimes that gets you into problems, especially in organizations. And the problem is that today, we are preparing our students for jobs that don't yet exist, using technologies that have been invented, and trying to solve problems that we don't even know are problems yet. How can we predict what is going to happen in 20 years? What are problems? So the education system today is gearing up on the assumptions that we have today. And the best way to prepare ourselves is to think in terms of mindsets, and to think, what is it in this innovation society that we are moving in? What are ways of thinking? Or how do we prepare ourselves? I'm not talking about technically, that's a necessary condition, but it may not be sufficient. Just to have a good education and knowing the technical stuff is not going to be enough. Let's hear some of the advice of some of these people who, in the 20th century, were the pioneers. This is Charles Kettering. Anybody knows them? Kettering, I don't know, he had close to 200 patents, worked for General Motors. He was the inventor of the Delco. Remember Delco? Delco is the starter of your engine. Delco. He was the inventor. And he invented many things. Now, just look at it. If you have always
in the car.
Right, the Freon. If you have always done it that way, it's probably wrong. Yet, if you think of it, a lot of us in our lives, in our organizational personas, are in a comfort zone. In the innovation society of the future, this way of thinking is not going to get us very far. This gentleman, Albert Szent-Györgyi, he was the one who discovered vitamin C, Nobel laureate. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. In terms of an innovation-oriented mindset. I mean, these are some profound observations by people who have lived through tremendous intellectual challenges. Yet they bring it down to something very, very simple. It's not rocket science, but it's as difficult. And this gentleman that I admire very much, I mean, he says, really, this thing that I've had is the gift of fantasy. Forget about the knowledge I've had. I mean, these are examples to just bring home the point that it's technical excellence and knowledge is very important, but the way we prepare ourselves to deal with it is as important in terms of innovation. Can I ask anybody, how do you define innovation? Anybody? What does it mean to you? It probably means different things to all of us, right?
Finding new ways to solve the problem.
Finding new ways to solve the problem.
I think that you described it correctly, so it's finding smartest way between 2 points, so it could be an innovation.
Yes.
So if you find the smartest way, then what it used to be, so it's innovation.
If you bring it down, I tried to deal with this concept, and I came down with very simple thing in my own mind. Because I think that one of the basic ingredients of any innovative way of looking at it or things is creativity, trying to imagine new ways of doing things. But there is a risk element, because unless we're prepared to take risk, we're just not going to do things. It doesn't mean that we will always succeed. And that's the thing to teach our children, the next generation. That this risk-taking and trying to be creative and not doing things just the way we have been used to is a main challenge. Now, if we assume that for the time being that this is correct or has some validity, how about creativity? How do we define creativity? Anyone wants to take a crack?
Finding new ways to do things.
Pardon?
Finding new ways to do things.
Okay. What else?
Making something that didn't exist before.
Right. That was the way I came up with. I look back into my own self when I was a child. How do we, when we grow up, when we learn, forget about all the nice university theories and everything. Go back to when we were kids. How did we learn? One of the greatest joys of my life was just figuring things out. That gave me a lot of excitement. It triggered that little dopamine in the brain. That is the key to creating new minds that are innovative or think creatively, etc. But the best creative moments come not through flashes of insight, but by flashes of insight and not rational deduction. One of the biggest challenges we have is to step out of this mental state that we have based on all the things that we have learned in school and everything. Everything has to be rational. Well, not necessarily. Soraya and Sohela were born on the same day of the same month of the same year to the same mother and the same father, yet they are not twins. If you know the answer to it, keep quiet. How is it possible? They were born on the same day, to the same month, to the same year, to the same mother and the same father, yet they're not twins.
It's the same person. Middle name.
Soraya and Sohela.
No, but he used where. It means that
Pardon?
he used the where, so it means that there are two persons.
Yes.
You are saying that they are twins. What's the definition?
not.
At the same time coming out, or?
I see. Well, you're getting close.
First name and middle name.
This is one of those things that the reason I ask whether you have heard this before, because these things have been done several times, particularly people who are in psychology, etc. They know. The answer is that they are not twins; they're actually triplets. Yeah, or quadruplets. But the point here is that our mind immediately is framed within this box. Twins, you have heard, and therefore you're not stepping out of that box. And that's the problem we have when we are in organizations, in our daily lives. We are prisoners of some of these boxes. And the challenge is stepping out of these boxes and seeing the world or the problems through a new perspective. It's easier said than done. That's the point I'm trying to make. You all have a little piece of index card in front of you. And you have a pencil or a pen. Those of you who have done this, stay quiet. The challenge for us here is draw 4 continuous lines connecting all the dots without lifting your pencil from the paper. Just take 2 minutes, try to figure out. Just have these 9 dots. Try to cover them all with 4 lines that are straight. They're connecting, but don't lift your pencil from the paper. And if you have the answer, keep quiet. Anyone solved it? Doing progress?
It's not
توصل مسألة رو کردیم. Now, I'll give you a hint. Remember the previous one, Sohela and Soraya? It's a similar issue. Think out of the box.
You don't need to lift your pencil from the paper.
No, don't lift your pencil from the paper, no. And they have to be straight lines.
Yep.
Okay? You got it?
Sure.
Good. All right. Let's see. Now you see the issue? Our eyes, our brains were focused on these 9 dots as a box. And we were operating within it. The minute you step out of it, you solve the problem. And the issue in organizational lives of ours, and I'll come to the implications for organizations, is that we keep on falling into these boxes all the time. Unable to see from the outside. And a lot of the conundrum of innovation, creativity, etc., is because of that. Now, essentially, if you start from here, you go 1, 2, 3, 4. But on the previous thing, this was the problem, that you were thinking in these terms. Okay? So, imagination. If you want an interesting book, strongly recommend How Creativity Works. Fascinating examples there of people, processes, etc., etc. And it's all about this going out of these boxes, mental boxes that we are prisoners of. What were our ancestors thinking when they came up with some of these great inventions, innovations? Just think of it. How did it happen? No education, no preparation or anything. What? Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, somebody had this great idea. How did it happen?
Serendipity, by accident, something happened, observation.
Cultivate creativity. You want to increase your chances of stumbling on an unexpected link or happening. It's being there's a book by Senge. It's called Presencing. Presencing in the sense of imagining things, being in the middle of something, but being aware of everything around you, and not just looking straight. And then you see the 360-degree types of perspectives. And unexpected links. A lot of the innovations, inventions over history have been these unexpected links. Somebody else has done something, and I've been doing something else, and all of a sudden, flash. That's an idea that I can use for my own things. That's the kind of mental exercises. And when you bring it to the organizational level, how do you cultivate this way of thinking? One of the greatest or controversial inventions of a century ago. Now, where did the idea come from? Do you ever thought, why does it look like that? Why does it have 4 wheels? Why does it have these little things? You know, we were creating a horseless carriage with the first car. Put an engine in it, but we thought of it in terms of the horse-drawn carriage, because that was the way our mindset was habituated or accustomed to it. So all these little bells and whistles, even the light, everything was borrowed from the way the carriage here was. Just drop the horse, and this thing looks exactly like you have there. And it will take 30 more years for somebody to figure out, why do we need to have 4 wheels? So this guy, an Italian guy, he invented this 1-wheel car. Okay, he didn't get anywhere. The point is about how, you just establish the parameters that any moving object has to have 4 wheels. No. And then, of course, it's all about the mental exercises that we have and how we are dealing with these things in our daily lives. So that brings me to sort of implications for organizations. A friend of mine, Ari, Dutchman, he worked at Shell Oil Company. I mean, this is not fluff. I mean, they produce real stuff and controversial stuff. Many years ago, they wrote this in the 90s. Already they were thinking of talking and thinking about their company as a living organism. Now imagine how counterintuitive that thing was at the time. Even today, many organizations think of themselves as machines. All the analogies, we drive for results. We have all kinds of these images of the organization as being a machine. Input and outputs. I don't know, the hierarchical things. Everything is geometrical. Everything is straight lines. But if you look at an organization as a living mechanism, as a living organism, a lot of those things do not hold, and you start developing schizophrenia. So when we talk about businesses, companies, these are words. None of us will know this. I didn't know this before. This is in Swedish. These are Chinese characters, 3,000 years old. What they have in common is they are the words that were used in Sweden and China 3,000 years ago for what we call business. And guess what they mean actually? Nourishment for life. Would we ever think of a business or an organization as a nourishment for life? life, survive, meaning. This is what the Chinese were talking about in terms of when they wanted to say this is a business. Meaning. You see, there's no mechanical aspect to it. It was all life. So we lost the ability to deal with these things and became prisoners of the industrial era and the machine world, and therefore we made everything look like a machine, operate like a machine, laws of the machine, and that's it. We're beginning to move away. The same shift is happening in terms of how we look at organizations. From machines to organisms, living organisms. And that has implications. As we moved from, this in fact was in the first, this was my rendition of the experience of the World Bank from the time I came in there, which was a hierarchical, pyramid, typical organization under McNamara. And by the time I left it, we were thinking of the future, something of this sort. A matrix organization evolving into what? Nobody knows. But something around people no longer being within boxes, but being parts of networks. You have one foot in one organization, you have another life in another network, and it's constantly, but it's no longer, it's fun, but from a management, because the old management notions still want to be things to be clean and organigram. Who is responsible there? I don't know who it is. Where's this CEO here? Over there, that was, we used to call him Big Mac, McNamara. Who is the CEO here? Don't know. Somebody may be in the middle, not necessarily on top, but it has implications in how we organize things. This could be an organigram of an organization. It tracks what? It maps relationships within the organization. Just as important, maybe more important, than those boxes that people sit in. Because the real stuff is happening at this level, between people. I remember, there was somebody in unit whatever, and of course, would pick up the phone and call my friend somewhere without any notion of or hierarchy. It was the network. And today, when we're talking about networks, this is what is happening. Now, if we look at an organization this way, they will all look different, because the relationships will be very different from one organization to another, right? Yet, our theories, our approaches, one size fits all. You bring in the consultants about management consultations of organizations, how to rewire this, etc. Everything looks the same. You have these boxes, and you have all these relationships, etc. Well, no organization is the same if you look at it as a living organism. Yet we keep on applying practices from somewhere else to a problem without looking at the nature and the context. If you look at an organization, whether it is a decision-making moment, whether it's the nature of the issues that you deal with, at whatever level, you could break them down into essentially 4 of these simple types. Simple stuff, simple issues, or simple decision to be made, complicated ones, complex ones, and chaotic. And some organizations actually behave in one or the other quadrant, either simultaneously or dominating persona of the organization. Most of them are here. Some are here. Very few dare to go somewhere else. Why? Comfort zone. This is the predictable stuff. This is the easy stuff to deal with. The minute you go there, very difficult because the parameters are not clear. It's chaos. The lines are not straight. So as organizations, we shy away from it. Yet, the most interesting stuff is happening over there. Problem is that we are comfortable with order. Things are ordered. The minute things are messy, we're not comfortable as organizations. We want to cover our rear ends. We want to make sure that the boss is happy. We want to make sure that in the end you're stuck. Whereas, as I said, the most interesting things are happening in the other two quadrants. Where's there's simple, you've heard about the best practice, and the World Bank was famous for all this nonsense. There is no such thing as best practice. Every practice is different. Every situation is different. Yet, we try to force it. Okay, the other space was good practice. There's not one answer to it, but a number of interesting ways of doing it, because it's sort of complicated, not as simple. But the minute you start moving into here and here, that's where innovation is happening. Now, organizations that manage to cultivate this way of thinking, or create an environment where this type of behavior happen, that's the future. Those are going to be the competitive ones in the 21st century. Those of you who were not here in the first or second thing, here's a company. Their stuff is, been to space, Mount Everest. It's a big company, 8,000 employees, 2 billion in sales. This is not small stuff. Yet they behave like a startup. They have done away with organizational hierarchy. They initiate projects without management approval. And you probably say, well, they probably, don't make money. And they have produced profit every year since its founding 50 years ago. So it is possible to operate in those spaces and yet make money. The smartest distance between 2 points can also be a winner. Gore. Have you heard of that?
Al Gore.
Not Al Gore, no.
He invented the internet.
No. Yeah, Al Gore, yeah. Who are the skiers here?
Gore.
Gore-Tex.
Gore-Tex.
The material that breathes. They developed that.
T-shirt stuff.
They developed that. 8,000 people. They are basically operate without, quote unquote, management as we know it. How do they do it?
Interesting.
They create a space for people to innovate, to think out of the box. They do not straitjacket them. They do not put them in boxes. This was one of the big debates in the 20th century after the Second World War about how much R&D are we spending. Companies went nuts competing or measuring things about, R&D is important, money is important. But when Apple came up with the Mac, IBM was spending at least 100 times more on R&D. So the fact that you're spending money on R&D doesn't mean that you're going to find the next big thing. And the point about at least what Jobs were, his experience was, that it's all about the people, it's all about who you are, the environment that you have created. It's the ecosystem of your company. And what's wrong with the ecosystem? If you look back to our origins of species, we are hardwired for what? To stay away from danger,
To survive.
to survive. From the days our ancestors were walking on, barefoot in Africa, we were wired danger. New things, danger. You stay away because it might be the lion, it might be something. So this is hardwired in us. Yet at the same time, and this prevents us from, welcoming new ideas, new ways of doing things. Remember at the one point I said when I was a kid, one of the things that it was the dopamine. Then we have the other side, somewhere in the brain, there is an impulse that when we have a new discovery or something, we get a high. There's a chemical reaction going on in our minds. Organizations have to find this nice balance between this tendency that is hardwired in us and ability or willingness to try new things. Most organizations stifle the second and promote the first with the kinds of incentives, with the way they operate. We probably have come across this in our various lives, organizational lives and experiences, in one shape or form. Your proposal is innovative. Unfortunately, we won't be able to use it because we've never tried something like that before. Sounds familiar? I know. We went through that. Similar. All variations of the same theme. Yes, let's innovate, but let's have a committee to innovate, right? But let's know how much money we need, but why do we need that much? All of this stuff is just a mental exercise that organizations have been unable to get out of. Because they have not focused on the essential of innovation. Even when organizations have thought of innovation, they've thought of it in terms of technology. Innovation driven. See, driving. Again, the machine comes out. As opposed to innovation enabling. Enabling your staff, enabling your people to innovate, rather than setting up a committee, a group focused on quote-unquote innovation. By tomorrow, 2400, give me the next best thing. It doesn't work that way. People don't innovate on command. Some organizations, let's have an innovation factory. This is the new buzzword, therefore, I want to have an innovation team. How many of you want to join the innovation team? The CEO says. Of course, everybody, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes. This is not about having another factory of innovation. It's a totally different way of looking at it. You cannot teach innovation. There's no instruction manual for innovation. Yet we keep on thinking in those terms. Brainstorming, let's go brainstorm. Good, but after a while, you say, Jesus, what did we spend our time on? How many of you have seen this IBM commercial? It probably, at least I thought it was one of the best over the last 10, 15 years. This fellow it's an IBM, and the fellow walks in, and he sees all these people who are supposed to be working. They're on this. He said, what are you guys doing? He says, we're ideating. He said, what? We're ideating. Ideating about what? About ideas. And the guy says, he doesn't understand. He just turns on the light and walks out. And it says at the bottom, IBM. Point is, this idea that everything, just look, it's an assembly line approach to innovation. It doesn't work that way. And organizations keep on repeating the same mistake over and over and over again, rather than creating that environment conducive. So in my book, from my experience, what happened to my... in my experience over the years, I've isolated about 5, I call them nurturing habits of the mind, to foster innovation. Questioning, a culture of questioning in an organization itself is a taboo thing. You don't question the decision of the CEO. You don't question your boss. Yet, unless you have a questioning culture and you're comfortable with it, some of the other things are not going to happen. Observing, pollinating, or networking. Ability to sort of see things happening there. It's not only what I do, but what somebody else sitting on the other side, maybe I will be able to, experimenting, associating, putting some of these things, ideas together. Many years ago, I was at a lecture, and there was this fellow talking about when they have heart surgery and some of these valves questions, some of the early valves were a big challenge because they couldn't figure out to basically recreate the human body and have a valve that would sort of open and shut, depending on how much liquid there was. And they went on and on and on. This company that was in the business of doing that, they spent a lot of money trying to figure it out, and they couldn't. And guess how they solved the puzzle? This fellow who was the project manager for this big challenge was somewhere, runs into somebody who is, this happened in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee. And Milwaukee used to build submarines. And the guy was an engineer in a submarine factory. You're beginning to get it? It was the submarine engineer who came up with the idea of how to build this valve in the heart, because the submarines have to have that thing of going in and up, and there are those valves that close and shut, etc., etc. That's how they solved the puzzle. Whereas all the doctors, all the engineers sitting there thinking of it that way were unable to solve the problem. The chance that you were mentioning earlier. But the idea was pollinating from different disciplines.
Out of the box.
And out of the box. And it happens that the guy was not really looking for it. It was just happenstance. It just happened that the other person was there.
But this one is good.
This is inside of the box.
Now, Mohsen, tell me, what's happening here?
Oh.
What is the dynamic?
You mean what's happening in my mind?
It's imitation.
Or Investor Soleiman's mind?
That's it. Hi, Dr. Begou.
Imitating.
Imitation.
Imitation, copying. But who's copying whom? Who is imitating whom?
The monkeys.
The monkey.
The monkey is imitating the... You think? Are you sure?
Are you sure?
You're in the box. You see, businesses have gotten themselves into this race in terms of competition, looking at what the competition is doing and trying to match them. And it's sort of like that rat that is on that, what do you call that? Something wheel. It's a never ending. But if you look back at the last 50 years, some of the most successful companies are precisely the ones that never copied anybody. In fact, they went out completely on their own. Innovation starts and ends with ignoring what the competition is doing. If you're trying to compete, you're limited because you're looking at a paradigm presented to you by that experience with certain parameters. And remember at the beginning, we all fell into the same box? That's the equivalent of the box. If you think of the competition all the time, you're obsessed with what the competition is doing. When Apple came up with this was Steve Jobs' question to himself. How can I have 1,000 songs in my pocket? He wasn't looking at the time of all those little CD players, etc. How can I do a better one? He just completely ignored it and went a totally different route. This is a desalinization factory, taking salt out of seawater to provide water, drinking water. And millions have been invested in these technologies, and usually these are technologies that are very carbon intensive, dirty, high carbon footprint. They're producing things. And of course, every year we have a little bit of better, the straight line thinking, etc. This is a desalinization plant in Spain, off the coast of Spain, Canary Islands, I think. Teatro del Agua. It's using sun, wind, and seawater to produce exactly what this with a zero carbon footprint.
Oh.
I went into detail in the first lecture. I'm not going to take the time. Just the point that you have to completely forget about what the competition is doing. It's called, the term is problem finding. We have been accustomed by education and experience into problem solving. But actually the more interesting and the more challenging thing is problem finding. If you go into a problem finding mode, you actually first have to identify the problem. Here, there's no problem. The problem is given to you. But when you start looking at the problem, then you all of a sudden come up with all kinds of ideas that are different from the way you were looking at them before. Does anybody recognize this?
Japanese garden? No.
Yeah.
Yeah, Japanese.
Where is it? What is it?
Japanese garden.
Were you here in the first one? Yes, I thought so. Because I know it's one of my favorite. This is Singapore Changi Airport. Singapore.
Yeah. Oh.
Now, think of your typical airport. You don't want to spend time there. You want to get out of it as soon as possible. They went completely the opposite. They've created an environment. You want to stay there. It is so pleasant. And this is the old terminal. The new terminal, Terminal 3, is even better. You walk in, there's classical music, there's a Picasso-inspired carpet. You walk around, you don't want to get out of it. Because they don't consider themselves. We went there with a group of World Bank people in 2000 to understand what they're... And the CEO said, I don't consider myself manager or a CEO. I consider myself conductor of a symphony orchestra. Our port engineers, our airport engineers, I mean, they were all, this guy, what has he been smoking? Then we went the whole day, we looked at their operations. And of course, we looked at the technical specifications, etc. Service delivery, 19 minutes from the time the plane arrives, docks, 19 minutes, your bag is on the conveyor belt.
Wow.
We checked 5 times, 5 different flights. And every time they beat their standard. And then when you're walking in there, it is a pleasant thing. Then, when we went for a debriefing, we told them that we were so impressed. And again, all our engineers, all our economists focused on what? On the technical side. Fantastic. Your deliveries, we checked 5 times and all the bags were on there. He says, well, thank you very much for these compliments. I'm grateful, but you seem to have missed the whole thing. The point. What point? Missed what? He says, I'm not in the business of running an airport. I'm in the business of running a big shopping mall that just happens to have an airport inside. Clicked. The way he conceived his business was not to run an airport, to milk as much as possible from all those millions of people that go through it every day, to make money that way. So the airport is a way of bringing customers for his shopping mall. Hence, then it makes sense. The more pleasant the environment, etc., the more money he makes. He doesn't make money over the landing rights. How many of you have been through Changi? Any? It's an experience.
The 80s, but I don't remember anything like that. 85.
Yeah, well, I mean that was this is much more.
Yeah.
Again, Singapore. And the reason I'm using this is here's a small country. I mean, this is this big. It's a city. It doesn't have land. So they've solved the problem by having what? 3 skyscrapers, and they've put a park on top. They've created this space, imaginative way of looking at things. Otherwise, it would have been Sita Asaman Kharashimi right in your eyes. That's that park over there. Behind it, they call them super trees. These are temperature regulators. They collect the water, and the buildings around there, they use all this stuff to release heat, absorb heat whenever necessary, etc. Imaginative way of looking at urbanization, at urban. So it's not about just companies, it's about societies. How do we live in the 21st century? Singapore is looking at it out of the box, creating new ways of living. Constrained by their space, constrained by so many things, yet innovating out of this world and beating the competition. In the 20th century, we were focused on business models, but they were product business models. 21st century is going to be about behavior business models. Very different logic. There you were talking about how do we make things better, cheaper, and faster. Here, why do we do what we are doing, and how do we change people's behaviors so that they can buy more of our stuff? Different way of approaching. The business model is very different. When Apple came up with that iPod, it was not just a new way of exchanging music. It changed our relationship, our behaviors in terms of music, right? We no longer think of music the same way we did before. Changing of the behavior. Google. When Google came out, there were 50 other search engines. Google's innovation was not search engine. Google's innovation was, it is now, the biggest advertising agency in the world disguised as engine, search engine. They changed the behavior in the sense that they managed to figure out how we surf and collect the data and then sell it for commercial purposes. Advertising, online advertising. That's how they made their money. It was not the search engine. Everybody else was doing search engines. One of the biggest trends that I talked about in the first lecture was the growth in the middle class. 5 billion people in the middle class. Today we are 3. This additional 2 billion, all of it, almost all of it is going to be in developing countries, emerging economies. Basically, Europe, United States, and all the industrial countries are going to be more or less stagnant in terms of number of, all of it is going to come from there. What kind of products will they want? So if you're in a businessman trying to, in terms of innovation, you have to think what your customers are going to be like. They're not going to be like the ones that you see around here, us, in this country. They'll be totally different, different tastes, different needs. On top of the 5 billion, by the middle of the century, we'll have 2 billion more at the bottom of the pyramid, the poorest. 7 billion people that are a potential customer base. What kind of products are we going to be providing them? The concept of frugal innovation. Previous model was more from less. More bang from less inputs. More performing laptops, more this and that. But still, those billions will not be able to afford it. How do we do more from less for more people? That's the challenge. Mercedes is easy. $100,000. If you have the money, you buy it. Figure out a car at $2,000, $2,500. And it is not just taking the bells and whistles away. It's completely rethinking the notion of the engine for a different market. They've had some problems, Tata Motors, etc., but that's a different thing. It's just that from the innovation perspective, frugal innovation. Thousands of dollars for this machine that does electrocardiograms. Fine, here. And then you receive the bill, Medicaid, or your insurance pays for it. But you're in that billions who are not having access to that. How are you going to do cardiograms there? This stuff costs less than $700, and each cardiogram costs less than $1. So those 2 billion at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, if you start thinking in terms of margins, here you have to go on margins. Here you go on volume. Smallest, but you've got billions. So concept of cost cutting that we've been used to is being transformed into cost innovation. How do you innovate in terms of ideas about cost? Tata Motors, that what do you call it? What was it? Nano? Oh, no.
Nanotechnology.
No. The car, the machinist. I forgot. That's about cost innovation. You innovate the way you design the thing so that the cost goes down. It's not that you take a big car and you start chopping and removing things. You re-engineer completely, you design it differently with a different market, etc. in mind. If you look back over 150 years, modern business innovations, the sweatshop the assembly line, lean manufacturing, flexible networks, frugal innovation. What is interesting is that everything was happening in the West. Increasingly, it's moving away. New ideas are springing up. And when I talk about innovation, it's not just products and it's not just organizing things, but new ways of creating business models, new way of operating things. Artificial boundaries. Another way of saying, get out of the box. Google X, have you heard of Google X? Those who are in computer information technology. Google X is precisely to think out the craziest ideas you can think of. Just go at it. They've got a lot of money, and Apple's have a lot of money to permit themselves this. I'm not suggesting everybody should be doing it, but it's the approach to things. They call it the moonshot factory. Now, the idea of earlier when I was saying about that heart valve was different disciplines pollinating each other. Will be increasingly coming from imaginative fusion of existing knowledge across disciplines. And organizations have a difficult time making that happen. So the biggest challenge we're going to have is trying to pollinate across disciplines, across networks, and trying to bring all of this stuff to make sense in an organizational context. Wikipedia was an example. This is a car manufactured in Brazil. It's called Fiat Mio. It was entirely designed through crowdsourcing. Thousands of people contributed ideas to the design of this car. Different way of running. And of course, the problem is that we have the wisdom of the crowds, but we also have the dumbness of the crowds. Businesses have to be careful not to fall into those traps. The last thing I will leave with you as the trend, sharing economy. How many of you have used the Uber? Uber. Airbnb. See, it's beginning. This is all innovation in the way we operate. New businesses, new business models. The sharing economy is a totally different way of looking at the business model. I'll leave you with the last words of wisdom from Edison. After all said and done about innovation, if the people you have, or you yourself, or organizations are not comfortable with failing, they will never innovate. And with that, I'll leave you with this thought of our سپهدار مزگان در 5 روز دیگه 29 بهمن.